Hello and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 19th Sunday after Pentecost, when our scripture reading is in the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verses 22 through 31. The same night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some have talked about this passage in Scripture as a depiction of God wrestling. Who is it indeed that Jacob meets at the Jabbok and with whom he wrestles all night long until the day is breaking? This is Jacob's second night experience. In chapter 28, it was clearly God who met Jacob at Bethel, and so after Jacob sees the ladder with angels ascending and descending, he calls that place the gate of heaven and the house of God. But here at the Jabbok, the question is not as clear who it is that he meets. Those who know folklore from around the world see in this a form of story in which a dangerous river, and the Jabbok can be very dangerous, a dangerous river is guarded or has a patron in a river spirit. And the river spirit has to be placated before one can cross the river. Otherwise, the river might consume the person, drown the person, wash them away in the attempt to cross. And surely there may be some elements of that story here, although virtually everything associated with those folk tales has been changed around in this story, because the scriptures of ancient Israel don't recognize river spirits as little godlets who control some part of the earth. There is only one God after all. But then who is it with whom Jacob wrestles? It says in the text that it was a man. That's really all. And the individual is clearly intent on getting away from Jacob when the sun is rising, when the domain of things like river spirits comes to an end because they reign in the darkness. And yet it can't be a river spirit. In the context of this story, it would seem quite possibly to be Jacob wrestling with his memory of his brother Esau, with whom, after all, he has a very fraught history. It was Esau from whom he stole or bargained away their father's inheritance, which was Esau's birthright. And Jacob managed to get it from his brother and get it from his father under rather sketchy circumstances. And it was shortly after that that their father, Isaac, sent Jacob away to Haran to relatives in Mesopotamia to find himself a wife, but also perhaps to settle down some of the steaming anger that was between Esau and Jacob. And so it was that Jacob had one of these night experiences in Bethel on his way out of the land. And now this is a night experience at the Jabbok as he comes back into the land. The first one was clearly with God, and it was the promise that God would always be with Jacob and would bring him back to this land which had been promised to the ancestors. This one now seems to be more about when you're entering the land as Israel, you will be held accountable for your actions and for your relationships. It's interesting that in this passage, Jacob names the place Peniel, face of God, saying, I've seen God face to face and my life is preserved. In the very next passage, when he crosses the Jabbok in the morning and he encounters Esau, and Esau is benevolent toward him and welcomes him, and they fall on each other hugging, Jacob says to Esau, I have seen your face, and it's like seeing the face of God. But this is Esau, to whom Jacob is accountable. And does that face of God in the night wrestling and in meeting Esau speak to the fact that before God, we will always be accountable as God's people? Of course, this is also the passage in which Jacob is renamed Israel by this figure with whom he has wrestled. This is the first time in the biblical narrative when Israel is named in the sense of being all of the people, all those descended through Jacob's 11 children here, and then also Benjamin, who is born later on. And as this is a composite text drawn from different parts of the community, it's quite possible that part of what's going on here is that Jacob's stories and Isaac's stories and Abraham's stories, which may have come into the collective identity of Israel from different groups, are here being drawn together under this one name. They may have different backgrounds and memories and experiences as different peoples, but together they will travel forward under the name of Israel. And then a third thing to notice about this text is that there are a number of what we call etiologies, little stories that tell about the source of something in the present day, of course, in the biblical writers' present day. And so the name of Israel is one of those. How did we get named Israel? Oh, it was at the end of this night experience that Jacob had. And then was there a tradition that Jacob had a limp? Well, this could be the story that explains why it is that that particular ancestor had a limp and was remembered for limping. And certainly, because the very next verse after where we stop reading makes it clear, this is a story that explained to the Israelites one of their kosher food regulations, that they didn't ever eat the thigh muscle on the hip socket. Why? Because that is where Jacob had been touched and injured. So, what do we do with all of this? Well, there are lots of things one can do with it. There are so many bits and pieces in this story, and the storytelling is so rich. It seems to me one thing we can do is to recognize that this is the story of a character who has been chosen by God. Not because of the character's great virtue, but because God has chosen to put God's blessing on this person. But it's not just blessing. The blessing is assured when the person is going out of the land into unfamiliar territory, out into what is unknown and uncertain. That's when God's blessing is assured. When one comes into one's own, back to the land, when one is in the place where one has a measure of ownership and control and power, then being chosen is about living with responsibility. Responsibility. in our relationships, responsibility even to see God and God's face in those perhaps that we have harmed and who choose a different way to live nearby. Our way as God's people is not to engage them in battle and defeat them so that ours is the only way, but rather in having that encounter to find the blessing from them and for them, and thereby perhaps to glimpse the face of God. God bless.